In the fall, when you look up into the sky, you may see a flock of wild geese flying south for the winter. They come from marshlands farther north. If there happens to be water in the area where you live, they may come down to rest during their trip. Or you may come upon some wild ducks resting from their southward trip. They may stay for a day or two, or maybe even for several weeks. These long flights of birds are called migration. Here's another bird that migrates. You can guess its name, a red-winged blackbird. In the fall, blackbirds gather in flocks and fly south, although not as far as the geese and ducks. The robins migrate too, but in a different way. They don't gather in flocks, but each bird works its way southward day by day as it searches for insects and worms. Getting food and not the cold weather is the big problem for birds in winter. But not all birds migrate. The goldfinch, for instance, lives on seeds, which it can find all winter long on weed stems that the snows aren't likely to cover. Starlings don't migrate either. They eat many kinds of food, including scraps that people leave behind. They're noisy, quarrelsome birds, and they aren't liked much by many bird lovers. The English sparrows stay the year round too. Birds don't store food like the squirrels do. See how this blue jay keeps pecking away? Birds must eat very often to give them the energy they need, and usually it's all they can do to find enough food for the moment. Fall is a time you often see unusual birds. This snowy owl is a visitor from the far north. It has come to spend the winter here. It eats small animals, and the hunting here is better in winter than it is in its more northern home. So just before winter is a good time to be watching birds even more closely than before. When winter closes in, you may think all the birds are gone. But watch this. These are sharp-tailed grouse. They're very much at home in the winter snows of some of our western states. And here's a fine example of protective coloring in birds. These are called ptarmigans. They're a kind of grouse. Notice the white feathers. As winter goes on, this bird will become almost all white. Spiny feathers will grow in its toes that will help it walk in the snow. Yes, you can find a lot of bird life in winter, like these English sparrows, which have found bread that someone has put out. The winter birds you see will fall into two groups. One group, like these sparrows, stay all year round. They're called permanent residents. English sparrows are as common in the city streets as they are in the country. The second group includes the snowy owl, whom we met before. They're called winter visitors, since they'll return north in the spring. You can see this owl has caught a rabbit. Notice how well its white feathers blend with the snow. Another example of protective coloring. Do you recognize this bird? Yes, it's a robin. Once in a while you find one in winter that has stayed behind for some unknown reason. See how it has fluffed up its feathers to keep warm. Birds can stand very cold weather. As long as this robin can find food, it will probably live through the winter. Let's look at some of the other permanent residents. This one is a magpie that's found in mountain areas. Magpies are noisy birds that quarrel among themselves as they hunt for food. They're clever birds and usually quite fearless. The jerky flight of horned larks is a familiar sight in the prairies where they live all year round. Every region has its own group of permanent residents. What's this fellow? It's a downy woodpecker. It finds insect eggs and hibernating insects and larvae under the tree bark. The crow is a permanent resident in many parts of the country. This tiny bird is a chickadee. It's a permanent resident of woodland regions. As you can see, it spends a good part of its life upside down. Now, let's look at some of the winter visitors. These are waxwings. They'll move farther north when spring comes. You can find out from a bird book whether they come to your part of the country. Here's a winter visitor from the far north, the tree sparrow. No one knows just why it's called that because it's almost never found in trees. The junco is another member of the sparrow family. It's a winter visitor too and is often called the snowbird. This is the Harris sparrow, still another winter visitor from the far north. Can you see the 3 Harris sparrows in this picture? This is a good example of how protective coloring makes birds hard to find. Can you see the birds here? There they are. These are redpolls, winter visitors in this particular area. Since different places have different winter visitors, you'll enjoy learning about the ones that visit your neighborhood. Since getting food is the birds' main problem in winter, there's a lot you can do to help them. One way of feeding birds is to put grain in a shallow tray like this on the ground. Be sure to use wood, since the birds' feet might freeze to metal. Put some feed outside the tray, too. Soon your tray will be found by... With a bird book handy, you can learn to recognize these birds, and you'll probably find many kinds you haven't seen before. There are many kinds of feeders you can use for different birds. Of course, the starlings and English sparrows may get most of the food. But here's a titmouse, a tiny permanent resident at a feeder made of a coconut shell. This is a chickadee at another kind of feeder. Here's a red-breasted nuthatch eating suet, the fatty part of meat. You can tie the suet to a tree without bothering to make a feeder. See how this starling is going after it. You've just seen this bird. It's a red-breasted nuthatch. And look at this chickadee at work on a rib bone. These are evening grosbeaks. Yes, with a pair of binoculars and a feeder, you'll have many wonderful hours. You may attract a cardinal, which loves sunflower seeds. So do the chickadees. But if you want the birds to stay around, be sure to keep your cat inside. So when the snow falls, remember that birds can't live more than a day or so without eating. and that it will be harder than ever for them to find food under the snow. By putting out food for them, you'll help them get through the long winter months.